Hello, this is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service, with reports and analysis from across the world. The latest news 7 days a week. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
This is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Claire McDonnell, and in the early hours of Thursday, the 17th of May, these are our main stories. President Trump says it's unclear if his planned summit with the North Korean leader will go ahead. The Nicaraguan president and opposition are holding talks to try to resolve the country's political crisis. And women and girls sexually abused by the US gymnastics doctor Larry Nassar have agreed a $500 million settlement with his employer. Also in this podcast, how an incredible discovery by the Hubble telescope opens up exciting possibilities for understanding the cosmic dawn of the universe's first stars.
What it says to us is keep going, because when you get those technologies, when you get the James Webb Space Telescope, you're going to be on the button.
And they've been banned for more than 20 years, so why are we seeing an increase in CFC emissions? Next month's summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un will be, according to Mr. Trump, a very special moment for world peace. But as we told you in our previous podcasts, the North Koreans have threatened to cancel the summit if the US continues to push for unilateral nuclear disarmament. Mr. Trump has now responded. He was pressed by journalists wanting to know whether the meeting was still on.
We'll have to see. We haven't seen anything. We haven't heard anything. We will see what happens.
So was North Korea's apparent change of heart a shock? Soo-min Hwang is the editor of the BBC's Korea service.
Actually, this move from North Korea has been a consistent pattern that we've seen in the past few years, in the sense that they would lay out a grand ideal such as, we agree to denuclearization, or we're happy to have the peace on the Korean Peninsula Treaty. But when it proceeds, it was very common for North Korea to say, we're not very happy about this and that. So in that sense, it's nothing unusual that this has happened.
So should the Americans have been surprised? A question for our correspondent in Washington, Barbara Plett-Usher.
Probably not, and they were probably, expecting some bumps along the way, especially as these are very tough issues that they're dealing with, and they're coming into sharper focus as the prospect of negotiations gets closer. But I think because of the unusual and extended charm offensive from Kim Jong-un in recent weeks and months, the concessions he made, the prisoners he released, and so on, also because the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has made 2 trips to North Korea, during which he said he had lengthy conversations with Kim Jong-un and explained to him what the Americans were after in terms of dismantling the nuclear weapons program, what that would look like. And so I think they felt that they were on pretty safe ground. So I think they're not quite sure what to make of this. Donald Trump in his response was sounding very uncertain.
Barbara, North Korea seems particularly upset about the remarks made by Mr. Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton. But as you said, he was just reiterating what had already been discussed behind closed doors. So where does this leave America? What's their next move?
Well, I think they're going to try to find out what this means for the summit. They have said their line so far is they are still preparing to go. They haven't been officially told that it's off. So they are going to continue with the idea that it is on while scrambling desperately to find out what's behind this statement, whether it's a negotiating ploy or whether there's some serious intent behind it. I think in terms of John Bolton, the North Koreans really don't like him. There's a history there. In 2003, during the Bush administration, when he worked for the Bush administration, the North Koreans refused to negotiate with him because he had called the father of Kim Jong-un a tyrannical dictator. And now, I think to their dismay probably, he's back, and he was talking on the Sunday shows about how he thought the disarming of North Korea should go. He likened it to what the plan had been with Libya when they dealt with the nuclear program. And that pushes all sorts of wrong buttons for North Korea, not least because that ended rather badly for Muammar Gaddafi. The people who he gave his nuclear weapons to in the end took part in backing the rebels, and he didn't make it. So I think the most scathing bit of that statement coming from the North Koreans was about him, and he may have been one of the triggers as well.
Barbara Plett-Usher. The scandal has been called the worst sex abuse case in sports history. And now hundreds of young women who were sexually abused by the former US gymnastics coach Larry Nassar have reached a multi-million-dollar financial settlement with the university where he worked. Michigan State University has agreed to pay $500 million after it was accused of a cover-up. Rajini Vaidyanathan reports now from Washington.
Earlier this year, a judge told Larry Nassar he'd spend the rest of his life behind bars after he was found guilty of sexually abusing hundreds of young gymnasts under the guise of medical treatment. During the sentencing, many of the women he assaulted took to the stand to recount their ordeals in scenes rarely seen in court. More than 300 women separately took action against Michigan State University, from where Larry Nassar worked, arguing the institution failed to take their complaints seriously. The university's now agreed to pay them this multi-million-dollar settlement. In a statement, it said it was truly sorry for what they'd gone through and recognised the need for change on their campus.
Rajini Vaidyanathan. The president of Nicaragua has been called a murderer at the start of peace talks aimed at ending unrest in the country. Protesters shouted at Daniel Ortega throughout the negotiations, following a month of anti-government protests. More than 40 people have died, and human rights groups have accused the police and security services of acting with brutality. Mr. Ortega called for an end to the bloodshed, but was jeered whilst he was speaking.
Who cares about political and religious status? It's simple. The blood of our brothers must simply stop being spilled in Nicaragua. And the police are under orders not to shoot. They've been told not to fire.
Well, our America's editor, Leonardo Rocha, told us more about the negotiations.
It took all sides almost a month to get together. The talks are being mediated by the Catholic Church, which is very powerful in Nicaragua. And both sides, they traded accusations with President Ortega, saying that gang members and criminals had infiltrated the protest movement, and the students calling for the troops to be removed from the streets. The protest began with complaints about a new pension reforms, but they have now turned into President Ortega, who's on his third term, and what the opposition wants is for him to go.
A senior member of Hamas has said that the majority of those killed in Gaza by Israeli forces on Monday were members of the group. The remark has been seized on by the Israeli authorities. So what exactly did Salah al-Barawil say? A question for our Middle East editor, Sebastian Usher.
Well, he is speaking on a Palestinian TV channel, and he's kind of defending Hamas from accusations that it was not out there on the front line, that it allowed civilians to go out and give their lives, and Hamas wasn't at the forefront. So, as I say, in order to reassure viewers that Hamas was there, he says, yes, but 50 of those who died on Monday. This is the heaviest loss of life, remember, since 2014 in Gaza. Well, Hamas members, he doesn't go any further than that. He doesn't say whether they're members of the armed wing.
So presumably, from the Israeli side of the fence, they will say this vindicates their version of what happened, just justifies it.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's the Israeli army, the IDF, which took a little clip of this interview and posted it on Twitter. And that was then picked up by the spokesman for the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Mr. Netanyahu himself has alluded to it now. It's across all the top pages of the media in Israel, essentially taken as fact, but it proves that the Israeli argument that it's been trying to make to the world, that it was purely in self-defense, but it had to do this, it was facing Hamas, it was a Hamas operation. This was essentially a terror operation when you get down to it, not civilians. It says that's vindicated it.
But as you say, is the key still, we had this senior member of Hamas saying they were members of Hamas. Is there still a question of whether they were armed or not? Because it seems to all hinge on that, whether this was indefensible force against unarmed civilians.
Yes, absolutely. And it doesn't answer that at all. You can be a member of Hamas. That doesn't mean you're a member of the armed wing. It doesn't mean that you're carrying weapons. It doesn't mean that your intention was to get across the border. And as Israel has said, as the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said many times, that these people were intent on coming across into Israel and killing Israelis. There's no reason to believe that any more because of this than before.
Sebastian Usher. Now to an amazing astronomical discovery. Scientists have made the most distant ever detection of oxygen. They observed it in a galaxy of stars that existed just 500 million years after the Big Bang. So why is this significant? Our science correspondent Jonathan Amos explains.
They've used the Hubble Space Telescope to find a very distant galaxy. But what's really interesting about this distant galaxy is what they can see in it, and they can see oxygen. Now, why is that interesting? They can date the galaxy, they can age its stars, and when they work that out, they can show that this particular galaxy, the stars in it, probably started to shine about 250 million years after the Big Bang. And that takes us right back into an epoch that astronomers call the cosmic dawn. So if you go back to the Big Bang, which is 13.8 billion years ago, let's say, what happens is the universe cools, and as it cools, it starts to form hydrogen, a little bit of helium and an even smaller amount of lithium, but nothing else. It's only when you get the first stars, when they ignite, that you get fusion at the centre of these objects, and they start to make heavier elements. So the iron in your blood, the phosphorus in your DNA, the calcium in your teeth comes from stars that forged these elements inside themselves by fusing together hydrogen and helium and lithium and getting to heavier and heavier elements, and then at the end of their lives exploding and dispersing those elements out into the universe that were then incorporated into new stars, exploded again, dispersed, and all the rest of it. And eventually you make planets and you make people, and we're here today. But it all goes back to this moment when the first stars switch on. And as I say, we call that cosmic dawn, and we want to see it. We want to be able to study it because it explains pretty much everything else. Certainly explains why we're here. But at the moment, the technology that we have, we can't see this particular epoch. It's not possible. The Hubble Space Telescope, amazing, but it can't quite see back to about 250, 280 million years. But we have a successor coming, which is called the James Webb Space Telescope, in a few years, and it has an enormous mirror and instruments and detectors that are perfectly tuned to see this epoch. And this is kind of a piece of the puzzle that takes us a little bit there. But what it says to us is keep going, because when you get those technologies, when you get the James Webb Space Telescope, you're going to be on the button. And then we'll be able to do a survey. We'll be able to point James Webb at a sky, just leave it pointing deep, deep into the universe. And of course, the deeper you look, the further back in time that you see because of the way light travels. We'll be able to point James Webb any part of the sky and just see what comes up on those detectors.
Jonathan Amos. Still to come on the podcast, we report from eastern Ukraine, where the US envoy is trying to broker peace.
Does selling weapons to a country really advance the cause of peace?
Absolutely, because if they're not able to hold the line, that's just an invitation for further advancements. And what this does is it tells the Russians very clearly, you're not going to get any more without it being very costly to you.
And if you're flying America Airlines, why you can't take a goat or a hedgehog on board, but you can take a miniature horse. President Trump has formally acknowledged that he reimbursed his personal lawyer more than $100,000 last year. His disclosure statement, released by the US Office of Government Ethics, doesn't specify the reason for the payments to Michael Cohen. They're classified as expenses. Mr. Cohen, however, has admitted paying more than $130,000 to the porn star Stormy Daniels shortly before the 2016 presidential election. My colleague, Karen Giannoni, spoke to our business correspondent in New York, Kim Gittelson, about this payment.
Well, it's buried on page 45 of this 98-page disclosure form, and as ever with these sorts of things, it tends to raise more questions than it answers, to be quite honest. So while President Trump has said that in this disclosure it isn't necessary for him to report the payment, they're doing so anyway. In an accompanying letter by that United States Office of Government Ethics, they actually said that payment should have been recorded as a liability last year when Mr. Trump filed his financial disclosure forms. So as a result, that's why this footnote is included in the 2017 disclosure.
What else are we learning from this disclosure, Kim?
There's quite a bit in here. I've been reading each and every one of these pages trying to figure out what's interesting in it. So there's quite a bit that tells you about what President Trump's property holdings have been doing this year. In particular, this old post office hotel in Washington, D.C., which was opened last fall, reported nearly $40 million of revenue in the year 2017. It's one of Mr. Trump's most lucrative properties. We also saw that there was a slight dip in revenue at his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida, but I do want to mention that the two time periods that we're comparing aren't exactly the same. In fact, his disclosure last year was for 16 months from January 1st, 2016 to April 15th, 2017, whereas this one is just for the calendar year 2017, which makes comparisons, frankly, quite difficult.
Kim, is this something that every president has to do each year?
It is. It's mandated by law. I mean, obviously, one of the major issues with President Trump is that he hasn't released his prior year's tax returns, which is another thing that most presidents have done. So this is the most insight that we're going to get into his financial holdings, which is why we're sitting here poring over these 98 pages.
Kim Gittleson. It's called the frozen conflict, but in eastern Ukraine, violence still flares. The Ukrainian army continues to fight Moscow-backed insurgents more than 4 years after conflict first broke out. Now the United States envoy, whose job it is to try to end the war in Ukraine, says more sanctions against Russia are likely. Speaking to the BBC, Kurt Volker painted a gloomy picture of the state of negotiations, saying he'd seen no indication that Russia was willing to step back. From eastern Ukraine, Jonah Fisher reports.
Ukraine's war has entered a fifth year, and the world has hardly noticed. With other crises occupying international attention, responsibility for trying to break the deadlock has mostly fallen on one man, Kurt Volker.
I wouldn't say it's impossible.
An unpaid envoy for the US government, Mr. Volker invited us to travel with him in armoured personnel carriers to the front line in eastern Ukraine.
So we've come to the town of Popasna. This is in Ukrainian government-controlled territory. It's right near the front line, and indeed the observer mission who are based here, well, they had to pull back. They no longer stay here because it's just too dangerous.
Some 6-7 kilometers this way, the contact line. Yeah. We have some 80 kilometers this way, Donetsk.
We're met by international monitors from the OSCE. As is often the case when delegations visit, it's a quiet day. But in a typical 24-hour period, the observers log scores of ceasefire violations, as both the Russian-backed rebels and the Ukrainian army exchange fire.
Do you feel like the world has forgotten this conflict, and does that worry you?
Well, Alexander Hug is the OSCE's lead monitor for Ukraine.
I think it would be unfair to say it has been forgotten. There is still attention to it, but the fact that there are regularly civilian casualties, regular on a daily basis ceasefire violations for 4 years, and we report those publicly, it has become the normal, and it's the normal that should not be accepted.
As is often the nature with these short delegation trips, a group of civilians was hand-picked and brought forward to talk to Mr. Volker. Theirs was a depressingly familiar story. Civilians unable to leave the front line have difficult and often dangerous lives.
Very nice to meet you. Thank you for meeting me here. For my apartment. Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
The mood changes when Mr. Volker meets Ukrainian soldiers. They're delighted that the Trump administration, and by extension Mr. Volker, is finally giving them the lethal weapons they've long wanted to fight against the Russian-backed rebels.
Does selling weapons to a country really advance the cause of peace?
Absolutely, because if they're not able to hold the line, that's just an invitation for further advancements. And what this does is it tells the Russians very clearly, you're not going to get any more without it being very costly to you.
Is there any prospect of further sanctions on Russia if the situation in Ukraine continues the way it is?
Absolutely. And you would have seen that we've already increased sanctions during the course of the past 12 months. And that is set to continue to escalate. There's no way the Ukrainians can take the territory back that's already been taken by the Russians. The Russians are just too powerful. But the cost to Russia of further advancement is already increased and will continue to increase. And if that's the case, then you have to ask yourself, if you're sitting in Moscow, what are we getting out of this? We're getting Russian casualties, soldiers being killed, fighting in Ukraine, for what?
It's a good question, but for now there's no indication that Russia does want out, or even to talk. Relations with Moscow are at a historic low, and it's been 3 months since Mr. Volker even spoke to his Russian counterpart.
Jonah Fisher reporting from eastern Ukraine. To Kenya now, where President Uhuru Kenyatta has signed into law the Computer and Cybercrimes Bill. It criminalises fake news, cyberstalking and cyberbullying, with prison sentences of up to 10 years. But critics say it risks silencing any voices opposing the government. Well, I asked the BBC's Africa business editor Larry Nassar in Nairobi why people are so angry.
Some rights groups, people in the opposition, in the media, bloggers are finding it problematic because this law, according to one organization, contains several broadly defined offences with harsh sentences that could dramatically chill freedom of expression online in Kenya. In fact, the Committee to Protect Journalists is saying that they are dismayed that President Kenyatta signed that law because of the hefty fines that imposes and long prison terms for instance, publishing false news. And fake news was a big deal in Kenya in the last 2 contested presidential elections last year. And now, for spreading fake news online, you might go to prison for 2 years or face a fine of up to $50,000 or both.
Is the concern then that what the government is calling fake news, a lot of other people, journalists, maybe opposition voices would say, well, this is just legitimate dissent?
That is the concern, that people believe in a country that has a constitution that guarantees freedom of expression, there shouldn't be any limitations as to what people can say. And the system is self-correcting. So if somebody spreads misinformation or fake news online, then other users will be able to call them out, and it should be correcting in that way without needing legislation for that. Because the wider intent for this is, I guess, noble. When you talk about, for instance, criminalizing child pornography, these are useful things that previously there were no law for. But the headline is that fake news and cyberbullying, which will attract 10 years in prison or $200,000 of a fine, those are the bits that I've seen to be a little of an overreach.
Are other countries in the region using similar tactics?
Interestingly, in terms of online expression, there has been a sudden trend in East Africa toward maybe limiting dissent. So Tanzania has just introduced a similar bill which would require bloggers, online forums to register, and it would cost about $1,000, something like $920 for you to register to own a blog, to broadcast online, to publish any set of content online, and that's seen as problematic there. In Uganda, the government is considering taxing social media users on Facebook, on WhatsApp, on Twitter, a daily fee, again, which people are up in arms against. So in East Africa, there appears to be this kind of trend to limit what citizens can say, and there's been a lot of activity on social media about that.
Larry Nassar. A sharp and mysterious rise in emissions of a key ozone-destroying chemical, CFC-11, has been detected by scientists, even though its production was banned back in 1987 after the discovery of the ozone hole over Antarctica. CFC chemicals were used in aerosol sprays, in refrigeration and in foams for furniture and buildings. Our environment correspondent Matt McGrath has more on what the researchers have found.
They've looked at a number of different causes to explain how the levels of this particular chemical called CFC-11, they seem to have risen since 2012. Now, they've not actually risen, but they're meant to decline because they're not being made anymore. They're, in fact, actually slowed down the decline by 50% over the last 6 years or so. And by working out all the other things that this could have been, whether it was, changes in the atmosphere or a number of other potential sources, the researchers have come to the conclusion that somebody is making this chemical once again, and they're pointing the finger at East Asia, and they think that that's where it's being made at this moment in time. There's been a great bit of news in the last couple of years, good news really, about the ozone layer recovering because of the actions that have been taken by scientists and by chemical companies around the world. What this would do, unfortunately, if it continues, is that it would delay the healing in the ozone layer by about a decade. What it might also do, though, is it might encourage other people to try their hand at making some of these banned chemicals again, because obviously there's some sort of lucrative market for it.
Our environment correspondent Matt McGrath. Now, from the 1st of July, you won't be able to take a goat, hedgehog or ferret on an American Airlines flight. You might be surprised that needs to be pointed out, but the airline has been forced to publish a list of banned animals following the rise of so-called emotional support pets. You can take a miniature horse on board, though. Support animals hit the headlines earlier this year when an American woman was stopped from taking a full-sized peacock on a flight. I asked the newsroom's Charlotte Gallagher what else is mentioned.
Really, really long list. And I'd be surprised if anyone had tried to take some of these on a flight. But here you go. Here are the things that are banned. Amphibians, so you can't take a toad or a frog. Spiders, insects, ferrets, sugar gliders, which are a type of flying mouse, snakes. Can you imagine if you had a fear of snakes and then someone sits next to you with a cobra wrapped around the neck on a plane? Animals with tusks, horns or hooves, very important exception, as you've mentioned, you can take a miniature horse. No smelly animals.
That's most animals, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think you can take cats and dogs. They are allowed, and obviously miniature horses, but you need a medical note. So basically you can't just turn up with your dog and say, this is my emotional support animal. You need a note from a doctor or a psychiatrist, because obviously for some people, like with PTSD, emotional support animals are actually really helpful in high pressure situations where they might panic on a flight, for example, and they really need something to calm them down.
And I guess more and more people are doing this, are turning up with these animals. Is this the reason that American Airlines have given for bringing out this list?
Yeah, there's been a huge rise, a 40% rise in a year, and some people are just turning up with them and not letting the airline know. So the woman with the peacock, she was told she couldn't take it on board, and she turned up with this enormous peacock anyway. Some animals weren't trained as well, and they were attacking cabin crew and passengers. So now American Airlines, what they're saying is you have to have a note for your support animal, you have to have a doctor's note for yourself, it must be trained, and if it misbehaves, it risks being put in the hold, and you won't actually be able to have it in the cabin with you anyway.
Charlotte Gallagher. And that is all from us for now, but there will be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can just send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Claire McDonnell, and until next time, goodbye.